Why is it that the United States, the wealthiest empire in human history, is currently drowning in $37.8 trillion of debt that it can mathematically never pay back? We are told the economy is strong, but behind the scenes a silent coup has taken place. The Federal Reserve has fundamentally broken the machinery of capitalism, creating a trap that even they cannot escape. It began with a specific mistake after 2008. The Fed switched to an excess reserve system, causing their assets to explode from 5% to 28% of GDP. They flooded the engine with so much oil that the gears have stopped meshing. Just like the British Empire before us, we are now borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed, a bill that now exceeds $1.2 trillion a year. So is this the end of the dollar? And when the music stops, who will be left holding the bag, Wall Street or you? Let's decode the system. Stop looking at the debt clock. The flashing red numbers on that billboard in Manhattan are a distraction designed to keep you from looking at the engine room. To truly grasp the collapse, you must realize that the $37.8 trillion of national debt isn't just a ledger entry, it is a structural addiction. Before we go further, you need to understand one thing. The current US financial situation isn't just bad policy or poor accounting. It is a fundamental shift in the physics of money itself. The system now operates on a new dangerous principle called the excess reserves regime, or more technically, the floor system. Imagine a world where gravity suddenly reversed. In the old world, the Federal Reserve only provided the reserves banks actually needed to facilitate payments and meet legal requirements. It was a lean discipline mechanism. But after the 2008 crash, the Fed made a pivot that changed the DNA of American finance. They began borrowing massive amounts of reserves from banks, paying them to sit on mountains of cash instead of lending it to the economy. This isn't capitalism, it's a subsidy for stagnation. The mainstream media calls this quantitative easing to make it sound like a sophisticated medical procedure. We call it the ratchet. Like a mechanical gear that only turns one way, every time the Fed clicks it forward to save a failing market, they lock the system into a higher level of dependency. Once you click it forward, you can never click it back without the entire apparatus shattering under its own weight. This is why the Fed's assets skyrocketed from 5% to 28% of our entire GDP. We have replaced a functioning market with a permanent life support machine that the patient can never leave. But how did we get addicted to this drug? To find the answer, we have to go back to the scene of the crime. The year was 2008, Lehman Brothers had just evaporated, and the global financial heart was flatlining. The panic was real. To stop the bleeding, the Federal Reserve performed what was supposed to be a temporary surgical intervention. They abandoned the century-old corridor system where they only provided the reserves banks strictly needed and pivoted to a floor system built on excess reserves. The logic seemed sound at the time, a temporary tourniquet to flood the banks with liquidity and prevent a total systemic freeze. But as any addict will tell you, the temporary fix has a way of becoming the permanent lifestyle. Here is where the tragedy turns into a farce. In January 2019, long after the crisis had passed, the Fed looked at this emergency measure and decided to make it permanent. They didn't just keep the tourniquet on, they replaced the limb with a prosthetic that only the Fed controls. The Bank Policy Institute doesn't mince words, explicitly calling this transition a mistake. By paying banks a higher than market interest rate to keep their money parked at the central bank, the Fed essentially broke the thermometer so they could ignore the rising fever of a broken economy. This policy created a massive expansion where Fed assets exploded from a humble 5% of GDP to a staggering 28%. In the process, they didn't just stabilize the banks, they euthanized the interbank lending market, the very pulse of a free market, leaving only a state-managed husk. They thought they saved the world. In reality, they just killed the free market and replaced it with a dependency that has no natural end. But to understand how deep this rot goes, we have to look at the internal clock of this debt machine. So how does this machine actually kill the dollar? It happens in three distinct stages of systemic rot. The first mechanism is the intentional death of peer-to-peer lending. Before the 2008 pivot, banks operated in a lean ecosystem where they lent to each other to manage daily liquidity. This was the heartbeat of market discipline. But in the current floor system, the Federal Reserve pays banks an interest rate higher than the market to simply park their cash in Fed accounts. Why would a bank take the risk of lending to a local business or another institution when the government provides a guaranteed risk-free return for doing absolutely nothing? As a result, the federal funds market has essentially vanished, eroding the very mechanism of market discipline that once kept the financial system honest. The second mechanism is the addiction, better known as the ratchet effect. To understand the scale of this dependency, look at the numbers. In April 2008, the entire US banking system required only $35 billion in structural reserves to function. By May 2022, that estimate for the necessary amount to keep the system running exploded to $2.3 trillion. As the Fed provides more reserves, the banking system adjusts its behavior to demand even more, creating a cycle where the necessary amount of money printing only ever goes up. Every time the Fed attempts to normalize its balance sheet or pull back liquidity, the market experiences a violent withdrawal, forcing the Fed to click the ratchet forward and print more to prevent a total collapse. Finally, we arrive at the third mechanism, the removal of all natural limits, or the monetization of debt. This system creates a dangerous illusion that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is infinite, and that expanding it is harmless. Without the constraints of a traditional lending market, the path is cleared for the central bank to fund the government's massive deficit spending directly by printing new money to buy treasury bonds. This isn't just a policy choice, it is the silent monetization of federal debt, where the currency is devalued to pay for government checks that the tax base can no longer support. The United States has printed the money to keep its own engine running, but the rest of the world is realizing they are the ones paying the ultimate price through the devaluation of their reserves. And now, they are starting to fight back. While Americans are busy watching the stock market, the world's central banks are watching the exit. The narrative of a stable dollar is cracking under the weight of reality, and the proof isn't found in headlines, it's found in the vault. A prime example of this silent rebellion is the massive global shift in reserves. According to JP Morgan, the share of the US dollar in global foreign exchange reserves has plummeted to a 2-decade low, now sitting at under 60%. If the dollar is so secure, why are the most sophisticated financial players on Earth quietly reducing their exposure? Where is that money going? It is moving into the oldest form of financial survival, gold. In an era of digital printing presses and runaway debt, central banks in China, Russia, and Turkey are buying gold at record-breaking rates. They aren't just diversifying, they are sheltering. Gold is the only major financial asset that is not someone else's liability. It cannot be frozen by a Treasury Department, it cannot be printed into oblivion by the Fed, and it does not require a promise from a government with $37 trillion in debt to hold its value. This mass migration to bullion is a clear signal that the world's elite are de-risking from what they see as a failing American experiment. They are trading paper promises for physical certainty because they know that when a system becomes bankrupt in slow motion, the only thing that matters is what you can hold in your hand. This is the ultimate smart money move, letting the masses chase the bubble while the architects of the system build their own lifeboats. But gold is just the insurance policy for the collapse. The real war for dominance is being fought over the lifeblood of the global economy, energy. For 50 years you needed dollars to buy oil. That monopoly is officially over. The revolt against American financial hegemony didn't stop at central bank reserves. It has now expanded into the very lifeblood of the global commodities market. We are witnessing a surge in non-dollar contracts for energy that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Due to Western sanctions, Russian oil is now systematically sold in the local currencies of buyers or other friendly tenders like the yuan. But the shift isn't just about escaping sanctions, it's about building a new infrastructure. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are actively developing BRICS Pay, a decentralized messaging system designed to bypass the Western-controlled SWIFT system entirely. This isn't just a technical change, it is a declaration of financial independence. Even Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the original petrodollar agreement, is now openly considering the use of yuan futures for its exports. The petrodollar is dying, and with it the artificial global demand that has kept the US dollar strong despite our domestic decay. When nations no longer need dollars to keep their lights on, they no longer need to subsidize America's debt. As the usage of the dollar in BRICS trade drops, already hitting a level only 1/3 of what it once was, the structural support for our currency is evaporating. The world is moving on to a multipolar reality, where the dollar is just another option, not a requirement. So the global stage is changing, and the exorbitant privilege of the American printing press is reaching its mathematical limit. But what does this tectonic shift mean for the person holding a US passport, a local bank account, and a 401k? You might think, I don't own oil, so I don't care. You should. Today you do not need to be a bond trader or a central banker to feel the impact of a crumbling empire. When foreign demand for United States debt dries up, and foreign ownership of our treasury market plummets from over 50% to a mere 30%, the government is forced into a desperate corner. To attract any remaining buyers for our $37.8 trillion deficit, the US has to offer higher interest rates. This isn't just a government problem, it is your problem. These rising yields drive up the cost of every single loan in the country. It drives up your mortgage rates, making the American dream of homeownership a mathematical impossibility for the next generation. It drives up your credit card rates, ensuring that your monthly balance grows faster than your ability to pay it off. But the true endgame is much more insidious. As the dollar loses its status as the world's undisputed reserve currency, its purchasing power evaporates. A weaker dollar means imported inflation. Everything from the beans in your morning coffee to the components in your next iPhone becomes more expensive because it takes more of our devalued currency to buy them on the global market. You are paying for the national debt right now, not through a transparent tax hike, but through the invisible devaluation of your labor and your life savings. Your hard work is being diluted in real time to fund a system that has forgotten how to live within its means. We are effectively paying a premium for the privilege of watching our own currency decline, which leads us to the final, uncomfortable truth that no one in Washington wants to admit. And this is the most critical point. There is no fix. The Congressional Budget Office projects that United States debt will hit 156% of GDP by 2055. This is not a speculative prediction. It is basic arithmetic based on current laws. We have reached a point where the national debt is growing faster than the economy that is supposed to support it. The system exists today not because of some hidden conspiracy, but because of a mathematical trap. If the Federal Reserve stops printing and attempts to normalize its balance sheet, the withdrawal causes a systemic depression. If they keep printing to monetize the deficit, we face the slow death of hyperinflation. The question is no longer can we pay it back. The answer is a cold, definitive no. The real question we should be asking is what happens when the rest of the world finally admits it. This realization leads us to a final reckoning that history has seen many times before. History is a graveyard of paper currencies. The British pound lost its crown, the Dutch guilder faded away, and the Roman denarius was diluted until it was worthless. The US dollar is not immune to gravity. We are witnessing a slow-motion bankruptcy masked by the complexity of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The ratchet only turns one way. The debt will grow, the interest payments will consume the budget, and the BRICS nations will continue to build their lifeboats. The era of exorbitant privilege, where America could print wealth without work, is ending. The bill has finally arrived. In 1945, America owned the world's gold. Today we own the world's debt. The shift has already happened. Most people just haven't looked at the scoreboard yet. If you want to understand how to position yourself before the next phase of this collapse begins, and if you value truth over comfort, leave a 1 in the comments. Subscribe to Financial Money History. We are just getting started.